All right, we are live. Let me share this real quick. All right, how is everyone doing? I hope doing well. Let me just do one more thing here. And there we go. Okay, I think we're good to go. So I am excited about this discussion tonight. It's a really necessary and important discussion, especially with things that are going on, and that's not necessarily the only things we want to talk about. But we want to bring clarity just to um, how we're supposed to think about these things, at least biblically, but also bring clarity around some of the issues. So, first, before I even get into it, my guest, Richelle Bryan, can you just introduce yourself real quick and tell us a little bit of your background?
Hello, Alex. I'm so glad to be here with you tonight. Um, my full name is Richelle Bryan, and I am a Christian apologist. I graduated from Biola University with a master's in Christian apologetics, but my real heart is evangelism. And currently, I work full time in philanthropy with a particular focus on incarceration. And so this topic is near and dear to my heart.
Amen. Amen. And so, as we get into this, well, we'll go wherever it goes, and if you have anything you want to say in the chat, please feel free to do that. But as many of you know, or hopefully all you know, I'm a Christian apologist as well. Um, but I have a lot of practical experience just serving in prison ministry, kind of like I say, boots on the ground type of stuff. And so there's things that you can only see and know when you operate that way. So there's a theological aspect, but there's also the lived experience aspect. And where we want to see is, where do those things coincide? Um, so let's just jump into it. The first thing, we want to set the groundwork with is, from a theological perspective, what is the problem you see, particularly with incarceration, with the incarceration system in the United States?
Yeah, so, before I jump right into theological, I just want to set some baseline features of our system that makes this a problem for those who are not particularly acclimated to this subject. So, first and foremost, we talk about the known issues, the issues that a lot of people know already, and that's the fact that we have a very large prison population in this country. And that stayed steady at just under 200,000 people until the 1970s. And then we saw a sharp rise, which we'll talk about, of course. And by 2016, we had 2.3 million Americans in prison. And that is a lot of people on its own. But when you put it in the general context of the world, you should know that us as Americans, even though we think that we're the center of the universe, we are actually only 5% of the population of the world, but we have just under 25% of the world's prisoners. And that is the highest rate in the world. And so what goes along with that, to our shame, is that we also have the highest rate of women in the global prison population. So we have the highest percentage in that area too. And then sadly, we put in detention centers, juvenile detention centers in any given year, upwards of 500,000 youth. And then with that increase that I just mentioned from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, we have people that went into prison in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Well, guess what? They get older. And so now we have an increasing elderly population in our prisons. So we have old people in our prisons, we have young people, we have women, which is crazy. And then, as everyone knows, we have a horrible racial disparity with, I think, just over a half of prisoners are Black and Latino, even though just about 75, 77% of the population is white. So we have a real problem. But then we have lesser known issues, because a lot of people know a lot of that stuff. Yeah. But the lesser known issues is the fact that we just have too many laws. It is far too easy to be arrested in America. And then also, it's easy to serve time if you're innocent. And we're going to get into that. And it's easy to spend a lot of time in prison. So it's not just that a lot of people are going to prison, and it's not just that people are innocent, but we have these incredibly long sentences because of mandatory minimums, which we'll get into in a bit. And so we also have a police force that has generally no accountability, because we have something called qualified immunity, which means that you can't, it's very hard for you to bring a case against a police department all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will not look at it. Mm-hmm. And then we have a system that empowers aggressive prosecutors, and they have virtually no accountability, and they have a lot of discretion. So they can have grace with certain people, and then they can also be harsh with other people. Mm-hmm. And that leads to a whole lot of inequitable treatment. And that's often along the lines of race and class. And so one of their tools is a plea bargain. And a plea bargain means that they can threaten you to say, if you go to trial, we'll give you this really serious charge, and you'll have a much longer sentence. You have a chance at being found guilty of a much larger sentence. Or you can just take this smaller sentence, maybe just parole or a year or two in prison, if you just say you're guilty, and we don't even have to go to trial. So we have a lot of people that are in there based just on plea bargains. And then the people that actually go to prison because they did serious crimes, they're guilty of it, they go to prison, and then people don't know that these conditions are even more deplorable than you think. And so things like rotten food, people don't know that they get terrible food. And a lot of the times this food is actually expired and not edible at all for any human being. And mentally ill people are locked up with people who are not mentally ill. The youth are locked up with adults and are sexually abused many times. And then when you get out of prison, they have something called a technical violation, which is a small law. It's a small violation that doesn't apply to people who haven't been in prison, but that will land you back in prison. And this could be something small, like you went onto the internet, you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and you weren't supposed to, or you were late for your probation to your probation officer. Mm-hmm. And so after all of those things, once you finish doing your time, you are still doing time because you are stripped of all of your rights as a citizen. So it's hard for you to get a job because you have to say you're a convicted felon, and most people won't hire you. You can't get a loan, a school loan. You can't get in housing. Landlords legally can discriminate against you for being a felon, and then you don't have the right to vote. And of course, there's the social stigma. So all of this is a social and humanitarian level outrage. And me as an apologist and a Christian, I look at the system and I see dehumanization, racism, greed, people stripped of hope, injustice. And I think to myself, why would a Christian nation be marked by an institution that's so antithetical to the gospel that we claim to preach? And so that's the problem in a nutshell that I am pondering and here to talk about.
Hope y'all took some notes. I won't even touch on the Christian Nation comment, but anyway, I'll just tell a little bit, some experience. I remember I wasn't always the same person, and I got what should have been well, it was a felony. And the only thing that allowed me to make it kind of this far in life, so to speak, is that A, I was able to afford a lawyer, and B, when I went to court, the plea, as you talked about, was they left the wording, which I still don't fully understand, but they knocked it from a felony to a misdemeanor. So now when I filled out applications, I didn't have to say it was a felony because it wasn't. Um, but had that not happened, I would still be me. I would still be, I think, a generally nice guy. I would still be, viable candidates for these jobs that I've succeeded at. But that one mark would have disqualified me off the bat. And so I'm not unique in that. There's so many others, and there's so many that feel hopeless from that, because now, okay, well, what else can I do? I might as well just um, go this other direction that I know isn't good for me. But like, what are my choices here? And so I think sometimes there's a misperception, unless you've had time with brothers or sisters who are incarcerated, to where you don't see them as fully people, as fully human, because it's easy to write people off when you don't know them personally. And we'll get into some of the other stuff, but when I'll save that part about the terminology. One thing that you said, and I think we need to, and we didn't really talk about this ahead of time, but that jump in the population. What some people may not know is that prison is a business. The job of a business is to make money. Now, I know we think, oh no, they're a criminal, they locked up. Well, that's not always the case. And once again, if you're not kind of connected on the front lines, I remember there was, and I was trying to find the name, and I just found it. Actually, in New York, Judge Mark Ciavarella Jr., and he was convicted for 28 years. This judge, for selling black teens to prison, essentially by, and I'm going to read this real quick. So he would take bribes, up to $1 million of bribes, from developers of juvenile detention centers. Then the judge presided over those cases that would send those juveniles to those same centers. And it came to be known as Kids for Cash. Now, you say, well, that's just one. That's just a red herring. What is it? Because there's other stories. I just can't. I don't keep track of all of them because it's just too many. But I remember there was one in Alabama. It's just like a hotel. When a hotel has vacant rooms, they're losing money. An airplane with vacant seats is losing money. Jail cells with vacant beds are losing money. The developers and the people who invest. And so it may be uncomfortable to think about prison as a business, and it is uncomfortable. But if you didn't know that ahead of time, I want to make everybody aware that this is not just a smokescreen. This is something that you can actually buy stock in prisons. Like this is not just made up. And so, we have to look at that as part of the cause of that explosion as well. It wasn't just everybody just started committing more crimes from the 70s to the 80s or whatever. At least not pejoratively, but there's a business aspect, unfortunately, to this.
No, absolutely. There's at the end of the day, there's way too many incentives to actually increase the population than it is to decrease, because there's vendors, there's all types of, they call it basically the prison industrial complex. There's all types of people making all types of money and gaining power. And even when I talk about the prosecutors, they don't get paid, and they don't get awards, and they don't get promotions based on who they found really guilty, who is truly guilty. It's how many people they locked up. And so they don't really care who's guilty or who's not guilty. And I'm sure there's going to be prosecutors that are like, oh, she's being unfair. Of course there's good prosecutors, but the system speaks for itself.
Wow. All right. Well, you kind of touched on this, but let's go a little deeper on, right, how did we get here? So there was that jump. I talked a little bit about the business side, but aside from that, like, how did we get to this point in this country specifically?
Okay, well, I'll give you the historical perspective, and then I'll give you the biblical, if that's okay.
Yep.
So I'm going to go into professor mode for a second. So of course, we know in the 1600s we started with slavery, and we had black codes. and or otherwise known as slave codes. And so white people can go out and in the streets, and if they see blacks just kind of out, even if they were freed from their master, they can detain them, and this was all legal. And so, as we know, 1865, slavery is abolished, but there was a whole civil war where one group lost that civil war. They lost that battle. They did not agree with slavery being over, and they were not about to give up. So in the 1860s, we have these vagrancy laws, right? And that was specifically targeted towards Black people. And it was just basically, if you're hanging out and you're unemployed, you could be detained. But what most people don't know is that they actually detained people's children as well. So they could come up with any light accusation and go to a black couple and take their child. Can you imagine if a police officer could come in your house right now and just take your children and then use them for free forced labor? So this was in the 1860s, and then that didn't last for long before we got to the 1870s, which was the Jim Crow laws. And everybody knows about those, but most people don't know they lasted all the way into the 1960s.
Yeah.
And that included all manner of evil towards Black people, including beatings and lynchings and segregation and all these different things. And then finally, we get the right to vote, 1969, I believe. 1969, Black people get the right to vote, right? 69. So now we get into the 70s, and we see that there's this big focus that started somewhat in the 60s with Nixon, but there's this focus on this law and order rhetoric, because there was a slight increase in crime in America at the time, but there's still debate over what the cause of that was. So part of it was that there was just more people, right? Because that was the baby boomer generation. But then part of it was there was the civil rights, riots and protests and all those different things. But before people go too far with that narrative, remember that there were decades of lynchings and Black people being burned at the stake and beaten during slavery, but that wasn't counted as crime, right? It was only counted as crime when these riots started happening because of race. And all these, and at the same time, they were saying, and these women, they want to work outside the home. So it's a switch from the 50s, the 50s, Leave It to Beaver, society. And then all these changes were happening. And so they were like law and order rhetoric, and we start moving in that direction. And so then we go right into the racially charged war on drugs. And then we start to see where things like even the possession of marijuana is punishable by prison. And at that time, there were it was upwards of 60, 70, 80% of these drug crimes were Black people, right? Yeah. And so in that sharp increase, so we're going 70s, 80s, we're seeing it double in 3, 4, 5 years. We're seeing the numbers double: 200,000, 400,000, 800,000. 1.5 million, right? So during that time, we're not seeing crime increase. We're actually seeing crime go this way, but we're seeing the prison population go this way, because the difference was that we were changing laws. So we were increasing laws to make more people break the law so that we can have that supply to that business, as you spoke about. And so during these times, we're seeing the prosecutors get more power. We're seeing plea bargains. We're seeing the Gun-Free Schools Act. So now we're seeing police being placed in schools, and they're getting incentives to lock children up, right? And so the reason why I go through that whole thing is because you say, okay, slavery, it was laws against Black people, you have to be slaves. And then we go into vagrancy laws, right? And it's specifically targeted to Black people. And then we have Jim Crow all the way up to the 1960s. Yeah. And then in the 1970s, we have law and order. So it's hard to divorce race from this. It seems like just a different pattern that evolved of trying to control Black bodies and minority bodies. And because you have to make it a law, of course, you're going to catch other people in that. So now where we have the biblical aspect, right? So from the beginning, this started because of greed. And that's in violation of Matthew 6:24. You can't serve two masters. So they came in, persecuted from Europe, claiming that, that they're following God. But then they were like, should we act like Christians? Or should we enslave people because we need them to work for us? And so they chose money as their God. And then they started to make a decision about who was good and who was bad. And it was based on race, because race was not an issue initially in this country. Like, it's a really relatively new construct, right? So then we have them being just like Adam and Eve, where they want to be like God. They want to control human beings, and they want to be the judge of who is right and wrong. And so they clearly violated Genesis 1:27. We are made in the image of God. And they set out a law that literally said, we are not human. We are 3/5. And then along the way, we create this caste system, which is in violation of Galatians 3:28. Now there's no Greek, no Jew, no male, female, right? And God knew that. When we look at the Old Testament, it's a big commercial for the fact that laws are not really efficient, are not really effective at changing people, right? It creates a judgmental spirit. It's inconsistent when people try to apply it. It confuses preference with divine law.
Yeah.
It's a preference.
It's interesting.
And so, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, because it's on my mind this week and these weeks, because we're teaching through Galatians right now, and so I'm teaching tomorrow or Sunday, and that is the totality of if you could encapsulate the message of Galatians. I was talking with somebody. I was like, when I, even BHI, Hebrew Israelites, like, I have one response: Galatians. I don't need to say anything else. Like, the law doesn't work to do what we're asking of it. The law is a mirror to show you that your face is dirty, but it can't clean your face. So that requires Jesus. And so anyway, go ahead.
No, absolutely. Like, the law is just not only is it ineffective, but then also it breeds more laws. So just like we see in America, where we just keep putting more laws and more laws and more laws, and they keep evolving to make the law apply to me and you, or poor people. We see the same thing with the Old Testament. We start with 10 commandments and we end up with 613 Pharisaic laws, right? But underlying all of this is a dangerous othering. And Tim Keller wrote a brilliant book called The Prodigal Prophet. And it's based on the book of Jonah. And it has a lot to do with what's going on now, the other, who's evil, who's not, that kind of thing. And he talks about when you want to be morally superior. So if you say, I am holy, if I say I am holy, I am morally superior, there has to be someone that I'm morally superior compared to. Those are the lawbreakers. I am the morally superior one. But the problem is that it's a false narrative. Yeah. And so you have to artificially enforce that. And the best way to do that is to create a law that makes what you're doing illegal. So I really look like I am morally superior. Yeah. So, for example, go ahead.
No. I'm just agreeing with you.
No, I'm passionate. So please cut me off when you need to.
Let it go.
Oh, so like, for instance, if we look at Jim Crow laws, right? A lot of people focus on things like sitting at the back of the bus or not being able to drink at the fountain and all the violence associated with it. But there were a lot of small little laws that were pretty ridiculous. So they would say something like, it was a law. You were not allowed to laugh at a white person. You are not allowed to show superior knowledge in front of a white person. And in a conversation with a white person, they'll call you by a first name, disrespectful, and you are supposed to call them Mr. or Mrs. And then you're supposed to introduce a white person first in a conversation, and they get served first at a restaurant. And just a bunch of laws like this that has nothing to do with like public safety and things like that. It's just to kind of enforce this idea of supremacy. And so that underlies all of this, where we have people feeding this system with people that they think are inferior, and then those people have their communities destroyed, and then it begins this horrible cycle. And then they go, see, I told you, they can't, follow the law to save their life. And then we have an explosion in the prison population. And so when we introduce the capitalist element, now we're really in trouble, where we have whole towns, rural towns, where everybody in the town, their job is based on the prison. We
Yep.
have we have politicians who in their district, they have less free people than they do prisons, but they get funding for all of those bodies, even though most of those bodies cannot even vote him in or out, him or her in or out. And then we have corporations that are using labor in prison. We have expensive phone calls. We have all kinds of fees associated with being in prison. And
Right.
so now you have this money aspect. So there's no way you're going to unseat that. But then you have a horrible narrative, because people are like, those people deserve to be in prison. And so you have this public safety kind of narrative. And so now you have no politician that's willing to put their career on the line to say we need to change this, because then they're going to be accused of making society not great.
Yeah.
And so here we are.
And here we are. Oh man. For those that are tuning in late, go ahead. If you have a question, put it in the comments. Make sure you share this. We're not just this is not to bash anything or anyone. We just want to give the historical context for how we got in this situation, how we as a people in this country specifically got in this situation, where it does seem that certain groups are specifically isolated or targeted in certain ways, and it doesn't even have to be. I think this is also what gets lost, because when people start to think about systemic racism, I don't, there is no systemic. It's just a sin problem. Yes, okay, that's true, but there is this pushback, because immediately for certain people, some people, when I start talking about it, it's like, well, I didn't do it, and I'm not bad, and I'm not, and it's kind of what you just talked about anyway, about the othering. It's so subconscious, and it's so kind of self-deprecating, that it goes missed. And so you have to really parse out, which is hopefully what we're doing tonight. Like, let me just break it down how we got here. I know you didn't do it, but this is what happened, and this is how it's affecting other image bearers. And if you are in line with who we put our faith in, then you should care that other image bearers are being negatively affected in this or any way. And so the same way we can go do a missions trip to Uganda, well, what about right here? There's people who need you here, and there's people who need your voice here. And we're just trying to say, look, this is, whether we like it or not, this is literally line by line, decade by decade, the history of certain things, because laws are public. We can all go, if we had the time, we could read all the laws that you kind of highlighted. So it's not like anybody's making anything up, but we have to at least acknowledge the historical aspect to even have a hope of change. Now, this might be a whole nother lie, but the other thing that has to be said is there's some people who don't want to change.
Right.
Face to face, they might say that. And I'm not talking about like necessarily people I know or people who are not really in a power to make a change, but I'm talking about the businesses that profit, some of the politicians. Like, there's certain people, let's just call a spade a spade. It's not in their interest for it to change. I'm just going to leave it there. So we have to collectively acknowledge that too, that when you start taking money away, that was a large fight of why slavery, they didn't want to give it up. When you get free labor, I was like, who wants to give that up? I mean, that's the easiest way to make a buck, have free labor. So let's call a spade a spade. Let's be honest with our history and collectively say, you know what? Okay, I get it now. Let's see what we can do together just to make this right, or at least listen. At least listen.
No, absolutely. My goal is Hebrews 13:3, which is remember those in prison as if you were in chains. So this is about education, and it's about unseating the narrative that everyone in jail deserves to be there, are horrible people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because this did start out racially motivated, but now this has captured a whole swath of the population. And then also in terms of the stigma, we have that stigma coming into our own neighborhoods. So, there are Black people who are afraid of people who came out of prison, because they think that they are violent. So, the narrative has gotten to everyone. So, there is a history, but it's just kind of like that is for education and to kind of get compassion and get people to move to remember this invisible population.
Yeah. So let's well, I don't know if it's really changing gears, but I feel like there's multiple lanes coming to the same point of convergence. When we look at, okay, from how Black people got here to everything through Civil War, to Reconstruction, Jim Crow, all that. Okay. So then we can look at this other lane that I want to talk about now, and it can't be that long because we weren't even allowed to be in integrated schools until the 60s. Let me say this real quick, everybody. The other thing we got to stop is the idea that because of 1865, we're good now. Like Richelle just broke down 1960. My mom was born in 49. Like it's not that many generations removed. Things don't shift that are embedded that deeply. They don't shift in one generation or two. So let's just be honest about that. Anyway, what I was going to say is I've been working with youth ministry over 15 years now, mostly high school, but also last year I was working in an elementary school doing social and emotional learning. And like I said, I'm a boots on the ground type guy. So I don't like to talk from the sideline. If I see the issue, as much as I can help, I'm going to go into where the issue is, whether that's in jail, whether that's in a city, wherever it is. I want to go to the people who need it.
Amen.
So I'm in this elementary school, K through 5, and some of these first graders, second graders, like the stuff that they're dealing with, like the fact that they can learn anything at all. And now where the neighborhood
Right.
from, that was the issue. The particular school where they were it was a charter school where they came to wasn't a really issue, but they carry everything from the neighborhood with them anyway.
Right.
I had one group of sisters, second and third grade, who lost 3 dads in the span of a month. 2 stepdads and their biological dad. One killed in a car, one found dead in a car, one was murdered. Another a fourth grader, he struggled with anger issues, as I did when I was in college. Not because my dad was killed. My dad did pass when I was younger, but like there's stuff that's in kids, especially in certain environments that they did not decide to create or live in, that it has. Any psychologist will tell you it would be weird if that kid just came out all,
Right.
story and like, hey, no big deal.
Right.
That wouldn't even make sense. But many kids make it, and they make it well, and they do great things. So I think we need to celebrate that more as well. But what I was going to ask is the school to prison pipeline. Can you kind of give us a historical background? Because and I know there's debate about this, about looking at third grade test scores can help you determine if you're going to fill those prison seats. And I know it's not a direct correlation, but there has to be, as with any business, some kind of tracking metric. But let's leave that aside because it's not conclusive. Let's just talk about, in general, what is the school to prison pipeline? What does that mean? And how does that play out in reality?
Right. So the school to prison pipeline is this phenomenon that people are being arrested at a younger age, right? And that age is school age, and in fact, they're being arrested in school. And that started with the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1990 or 1994. And so this is continuing on that history timeline that I set out. We have this law and order focus starting in the 70s. We have this increase in this explosion in the prison population, and in the 80s, this disastrous war on drugs. And so a part of that was we have to get the drugs out of the schools, right? So we want to put police inside the schools. And then a cousin to that was we need to get weapons out of the school. So schools actually were given monetary incentives to do this. So the federal government would say to schools like, hey, if you want to participate in this program, if you promise to suspend a student for a whole year, if you find them with drugs or with a weapon, then we will give you this funding, right? So you're basically paying people to put in this horrific system, which takes kids from school and puts them into prison. And so what's happening is that a kid, of course they're going to act up because us break laws, and kids break laws like hourly. If we break laws daily, they break laws hourly, right? Because they're kids. But the question is, are the police around, and are they actually going to go ahead and prosecute that? No, they're kids. But in this case, they do. And so these kids are going into prison. And the thing is, like, we even had a case, it was an extreme case of a 6-year-old, and she had a temper tantrum, and she was all over the floor in the principal's office. And so they actually charged her with assault on the teacher and vandalism of property because she was on the floor. She is 6 years old. And then and of course, thank God they had to drop the charges when it went through, the court system. Like, this is ridiculous. And thank God the parents pulled them out of school. So this is the extent to which they would even they would start to dehumanize people and feed them into the system. And then and the problem is, of course, again, we have racial disparities. We have Black and Latino kids that are suspended and sent to detention centers at multiples of non-Black and non-Latino, right? And then we have a connection with suspension and dropouts. And of course, there's debate about, were these kids going to drop out in the first place or because they were suspended? But the problem is, like you said, they have trauma. A lot of these kids are watching, their fathers in prison, or their moms bringing people in, and now their mom's in prison, and all kinds of stuff they bring to school with them, besides from just being kids. And then we put this on top of them, put them into the system, and then we know what happens after that. And so you have this inevitable increase, and now it's out of control. So, and that's really horrible in their formative years, when you tell them that they're bad and you put handcuffs on them. We have media, we are in love with cop shows and true crime and all, and CSI and all those shows. And we know the police are good and the perps are bad. And so you do that to them and you set them on a course. And so it's unconscionable.
It is. And as you were talking about the 6-year-old, because I had my toughest kid was a 6-year-old. I won't say his name. And so as an SEL mentor, social emotional learning, I basically only deal with kids who have issues. Like, I don't even get to talk to the quote unquote good kids, but I never, and that's why terminology matters too.
Yep.
Especially with my young Black boys. When I say young, I'm talking about 6, 7 years old. I would, and he would throw tantrums. He was swinging. We restrained him. He would hide under the desk. He would throw and there's stuff that he's dealing with that at a 6-year-old brain he can't process. And what I was able to get them calm, especially there was 2 or 3 I remember specifically. Being who I am, I could pull them aside. Now I know it's a school, you can't talk Christian stuff, but I can always share principles. That's what I tell people. So I'm like, look, let me ask you a question. I'm a grown Black man. If I do what you're doing, what do you think is going to happen to me? Like, I try to change that perspective just to get you to think ahead and say, look, it's no games out here. They're not giving second chances to us. Now, let me say this too, for those who may be hearing this and like, oh, y'all are just, trying to pin everything on white man or the system or whatever. No, we're not denying personal accountability.
Right.
We're not saying that no one should be held accountable for their crimes when they commit them. But we would be fools to ignore the fact that there are societal factors. There is a living environment. There is tracking in school, which we didn't even get into. There is unfair disciplinary practices, which you touched on. There is unequal school environments. I have a friend, one of my best friends, actually the guy who married me and my wife. I call him Pastor T. He started an organization called End Zone. Shout out to End Zone. And he went to New Zealand, and he wasn't going there to do this, but it happened because he's a youth lover too, youth minister person too. So over there, their minorities are called Maori, the Aboriginal, like the natives. So much like here in Chicago or any inner city or wherever, those environments, those schools and those environments are not up to the par of the suburbs. So he said, how do we get them to have better educational opportunities? Because I believe, like he believes, like we all believe, if I have equal education, no matter what color I am, I got a fair shot. I got a fair chance. So that's not even fixing everything else, but like, let's at least start there. So he figured out that there was a certain zone. Literally, you had to live in this zone to go to this particular school. So he was able to raise money. They actually made a documentary about it. It's amazing.
Oh, really? Yeah. I want to see that.
Millions of dollars was donated so he could get this house, where he took legal custody of about 30 or 40 boys. Because if he doesn't have custody, then he can't actually have the house for them. So the parents had to give up, but the parents were willing to do this.
Absolutely.
So kids could have an educational opportunity. Now these kids are going to amazing universities, starting a job. Now he started to do the same thing here in Chicago. So he's taking kids from inner city, and they have this huge house out in the suburbs. But the community fought him hard. Why? There was nothing wrong. He wasn't trying to. He's trying to take them out of environment, and they weren't bad kids. They're just in non-conducive environments. So he got them in this house. They're in a better environment. They don't have to worry about gunshots. They don't have to. That's not their. I think people misunderstand the fact that I had a teen one time tell me, because we're like, yo, you can't stay over there no more. They're looking for you, based on what his brother had done something. So anyway, he was out the gang, but they don't care.
Yeah.
So you got to stay somewhere else. Where else can you go? So I think he had an uncle, and he was staying there. He's like, it's too quiet. He's like, I'm used to hearing gunshots at night. I can't sleep. I can't sleep because it's too quiet. Like, what kind of childhood must you have where that's the norm? And that should never be the norm. So I think, like I said, people have to understand that when you put everything in context, we're not saying it's just bad cops, because most cops aren't bad cops. We're not saying it's just the history of slavery, because it's not just that. But if I take all of these lanes that converge, like if anybody makes it out, that's a testimony right there.
My word.
Anyway, I don't even know where we were before that, but let me try to get us back on track. Yeah, so I was just saying, we're not denying personal accountability. We're simply saying, especially with younger kids, no 6 or 7-year-old can process all this stuff and go learn. That's just not feasible. So let's look at why certain things are the way they are, and stop just saying it is what it is. Let's just keep moving on.
No, absolutely. And one thing I wanted to add about the school thing, just a personal anecdote. I'm a comfortably middle class woman. I have a certain lifestyle. And so I wanted really, when I started to look at philanthropy and see all of these adults in prison, I had a desire in my heart, like 2 years ago, a really, really deep desire to go backwards in the pipeline and get into the schools, because we just don't have enough minority teachers. And again, it's not to say it's a black white thing. Obviously I have white people in my family. It's not a black white thing, but it's just about having people that can relate to them, to say, I was in your seat. I grew up in a low income neighborhood. I mean, it was a West Indian enclave, but it was low income, and there's a lot of similarities to other neighborhoods. And so I wanted to do that so badly, but I had to go to school, get some classes. I had to do a bunch of things. And then I had to accept this really, really low salary, which I could not afford to do. So it was just kind of like, wow, I can't even afford to be a teacher. And that's because we don't have that generational wealth. I can't just go and stay, in my parents' guest house type of thing, or, take a couple of years and then they just like, subsidize me or something. So I wasn't able to do it. And I was just like, geesh, like you have to basically take a vow of poverty. And and for the audience, I live in New York City.
Mm.
So they might be like, like what kind of salary she needs. But like you need a, especially today, you need a really decent salary to be able to survive in New York City. And so I think that that's part of it too, in that there's just not enough. I think in New York City, we have it's I can't remember but it's something like 20% are minority teachers, and I think 66% of the kids are minorities. So we have a bit of a disconnect, and God bless the white teachers that are there. They don't get paid enough and they don't get enough respect. But we definitely need more people, like I said, who come from these neighborhoods and can talk to them the way that you talk to this boy. So that's another aspect.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't send a kid to prison. You know what I mean? I would just never do that. No kid would be in my custody and go to prison unless they are just like super ignorant, 19-year-old 11th grader who slugs me. You going to prison? You know what
Right.
I'm saying? But not a 6-year-old.
No. So, and actually, let's real quick, because this is apologetics as well. So let's like real briefly just reconnect this to the gospel, because grace and mercy are embedded in the gospel. And so I would say where love, justice, grace, and mercy connect is at the cross. Um, all of us human beings, we overcompensate in one of those areas. When we're high on justice, we're low on love, and when we're high on mercy, we're low on justice. We don't ever get the balance all the way right because we're not perfect, but that should be our goal. And if we're going to be image bearers and be in line, for those that are, I know some aren't who watching this, but for those of us who are believers, at least we should have a measure of grace and mercy in our approach, especially to kids. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
No, absolutely. And I think it goes back to the discussion about even the laws versus grace. So, when Jesus was asked about the law, he's just like, look, just it goes back to the first two, the most important two, which is, love God and love your neighbor. And so when you love God, you love his children and the people that were made in his image. And when you love your neighbor, obviously you love your neighbor. So if the government comes to you as a school and says, we'll give you money, et cetera, all of that could be legal. But now you have to go to a higher law. Is this loving? Is this the best thing for these children and for their families and for this community? And that's why God had to take it another step, because you had Pharisees that looked like they were following all the laws. They had the appearance of holiness. But then it goes a step further into what's in your heart. It's not just about killing somebody, it's about thinking of killing somebody, etc. And so none of this is in line with what Jesus was speaking about at all. Even if you are by the letter, when somebody misbehaves, I'm supposed to call the police. You know what I mean? Like it goes beyond that. And would you want that for your child?
Yeah, and I you brought up a really interesting point, because I always think it's a terrible argument. Thankfully, most people don't make it, to say XYZ is the law, therefore such and such. I don't care if you're Christian or not, because, but slavery was legal. So some laws are good and just, and some laws aren't. And if you want to have a higher law to adjudicate those laws, then how will you ever know which ones are? It can't just simply be it's the law of the land, because that didn't work out so good for several centuries for some people.
And,
Right?
and the thing is, those same people will go to a missions trip to the Middle East and they will break the law by evangelizing. So, like there's a higher law, there's a divine law. That's why man is not equipped to make laws, because then they're going to prefer whatever they do. So when you're in a Muslim country, the laws are going to prefer Muslims. And when you're in a country that kind of disenfranchise a certain group, these laws are going to go against the disenfranchised. And so God is like, that's why none of you are qualified to do this. I made a divine law.
Yeah. Amen. All right. Well, um, like I said, we're trying to give as much nuance. And if there's any questions that come to mind or any things you want to say, please put them in the chat. I see y'all in there. Thanks, Phil, Brother Phil, Shawnee, Neff, apologists in Detroit. Appreciate y'all joining in the conversation.
Our peoples are here.
Yeah, they're in here. So one more aspect where this gets a little nuanced as well is words and messaging. Words and messaging matter when we speak about people and even to people, especially groups of people, because I feel like this year I've had to drive this point home with a lot of different conversations I have. Like Black people are not monolithic. I'm not gonna get political here, but Black people are not Democrats or Black people are not Republic. Like that, we're not all in one box. Just like white people aren't, just like Asian people aren't. So when we use certain words to describe a group of people, and I'm not talking about N-word and stuff, I'm just talking about how we speak about them. I remember when I was growing up and I didn't think about it, I didn't really get it at the time. And I don't think anybody had any bad intentions in doing this. And my stepdad would always point out to me, and I think he was kind of a little overboard, but when he said it, I did start to notice it. Sportscasters, when they would, especially with Black quarterbacks, they would say he's such a horrible.
Articulate.
He's he's like a beast, or they would use these animalistic terms. But with the white player, they would say how mental, how cerebral he is, and how focused he is, and how smart he is, and once again, I don't even think they necessarily were aware of what they were saying or how it was coming across. But the fact that he was able to pick, my stepdad was able to pick up on it, meant it was happening on a repetitive basis. Now, subconsciously, that stuff can get into your mind where you either internalize it and act out on it, or on the other side, you act based on that assumption.
Right.
And so that goes a lot of different ways. We can talk about, you see a group of, now I'm not talking about like actual physical riot, tearing up stuff type of stuff, but I'm talking about you see thousands of white boys after a big game and they're turning over police cars and, destroying property and stuff like that. And they're just being kids and celebrating. And that same group, and at doing much less, would be called gang activity. Or so I just wanted to nuance this in that way, that words matter and messaging matters, and people who don't have a dog in the fight on either side, but they're just listening to the news, they're taking all this in either consciously or subconsciously, and eventually that plays out in how they act in regards to other people. I'm gonna give two quick stories. I'll let you go. My wife is an assistant principal at an inner city high school, and a student recently was killed. Now, let me give the backstory. He was involved in a carjacking, but if you read the news, that's all you'll know. He was a bad kid from the West Side, right? Well, if you knew him, you would know he's more monolithic. He's not that monolithic. He made a bad decision that day. He was funny, from what I've heard. He was a good kid, a good student, good brother, good son. So you're judged sometimes on your worst day.
Wow.
And especially if you don't get to live past that day, then that's the story, right? So if you don't know, if you're just reading the news, or if you're looking at the news and you see Chicago and the murders, well, all those people are people, and they all have other parts and components to their story. And I'm not justifying any crime or criminal. I'm just saying that if y'all knew me back in the day, you would have said the same thing about me, and I wouldn't be here, right? Or you would have wrote me off. There was another young man in our youth ministry, and we had to unfortunately have his funeral because he was killed. And we discipled him. He messed up. He made some bad decisions. He went to jail, served his time, came out, and he was doing right. He had a place. He was working. He wasn't with the gang anymore. he was doing what so what happened was his past caught up to him, and somebody caught him one night. What you're going to hear on the news though is ex-felon was shot, but that's not the whole story, is it? And so I just want everybody to hear and just say, let me pause sometimes when I hear these things, because, and I'm not taking away personal accountability. I want to stress that. I'm just simply saying they're still human beings, and we all make bad decisions. And in certain environments, those bad decisions can cost you your life. What would you say on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, my heart breaks from those stories that that you just spoke of. Names and titles absolutely matter. If we look to the highest source, we look at God. God literally changed people's names in the Bible. And when you see names, they actually, especially in the Old Testament and the New, but the names actually were intentional and they had meanings to them. So names absolutely matter, and rhetoric matters. So you see that with media, and you see that with politicians. For instance, when we think about the war against Iraq,
Yeah.
by President Bush, and they came up with this term, the axis of evil, right? And then a couple of decades before that, if you wanted to, the quick way to demonize someone was to call them a communist. And so in all of these ways, people just take a shortcut to signaling to other people that you deserve to be mistreated, which is just horrible. It's just horrible. And for minorities, and I shouldn't even say for minorities, for poor people, and then also minorities, when you do that, it has real implications, right? When you only show Black people in Chicago getting arrested or shooting each other, etc. I've had people ask me that who come from Korea and come from Japan. Like these are the images they see all around the world, and it has direct implications. So if the public views you, even if you're from Appalachia, which is a poor white area, like if the public views you as a criminal, then that's going to be a problem, because then a politician is going to use that to say, those people who you think criminals, watch me attack them. And that's kind of what Clinton did. Now he's so sorry about all of those laws that he enacted, but he was behind putting police in the schools. But he was trying to go with the narrative at the time of who were criminals. And so he went along with that to please the crowd. Just like when we have Jesus and Barnabas, and they're like, it depended on who they deemed was the criminal, and it was divorced from truth. But you know what? This same public, they are the juries that decide cases. They are the voters that decide politicians. So these have real implications for, for minority people and for poor people.
Yeah.
And then what the worst part is that it actually, because it's not true, what you end up doing is you do the opposite, where you look at people and you go, you know what? He looks like a nice citizen. He's the right race. He's the right socioeconomic, class. So I think he's innocent. And so you have something like a Kyle Rittenhouse, who can go and literally be a murderer and have Christians raise funds for him, because the narrative is not against him. So what you're doing is you're enabling real criminals, and then you're turning innocent people into criminals. And so that's completely against what God did. He's not a respecter of persons. He was calling out Canaanites and Egyptians and the children of Israel. And in the book of Amos, he's just like, you think, children of Israel, you are more important to me than the Ethiopians? Like, he blasted them. So, so that whole thing is just off course, and it's not in line with biblical Christianity at all. And it has very real and dangerous implications.
Oh, absolutely. Couldn't say it better. It's not funny, but the whole Lori Loughlin, and I had posted something, I don't know, last week or 2 weeks, and her husband getting to choose their prison.
Oh, please.
I'm
Oh,
like, like, okay, I won't go on that tangent right now. So let me come to one of our last questions, because now we've highlighted the issue, we've highlighted how nuanced it is, we've highlighted the different tracks from school to prison pipeline, the history, the theological implications, what how we got here, so to speak. So let's provide some hope. um, what would a better system look like to you?
okay. So I'll approach the biblical case first and then the practical,
Yeah.
right? I can't just answer a question. I'm probably so annoying, but the
No.
um the the Old Testament was a 39 book commercial about how difficult it is for man to follow laws. And so in the New Testament, we see an answer in the person of Jesus. And like I said, he gave two laws. And the law was basically that you love God and you love people. And so I think that this system should reflect that ethic, that we love God by honoring all of his children, and that we love people and do what's best for them, and not look for them to get the worst possible punishment and make their lives hell for the rest of their lives.
Mm,
So there should be a path back to a normal life for every person in the system, save for the absolute extreme crazies.
mm,
And if anything, they should have an even better life after they leave prison. They should have an option of a better life in prison. So when we look at the pattern in the Bible, we see somebody like Paul. Paul was literally murdering Christians,
yeah.
and then Jesus detains him, right? And then he changes him, and then he ends up being a person that writes most of the New Testament.
Right.
And the catch is that four of those books are prison epistles:
Mhm.
Ephesians, Philippians, Philemon, and Colossians. Prison epistles that he wrote from prison.
Yeah.
And then we have that beautiful scene in the New Testament in John 21,
Mm,
where we know that Peter had already denied Jesus three times.
mhm.
And then Jesus comes back and asks him three times, "You love me? You
Yeah.
love me? You love me?
Yeah.
Feed my sheep." And so here's this person who was like, I am nothing.
Mm,
I went and I denied my boy. You know what I'm saying? And then Jesus is like, you'll be my successor, basically. I'm going to build a church on you.
yeah.
And so here he takes the people who messed up, and this is the pattern in the entire Bible. And some pastor said, why does God use messed up people? And he's like, because he ain't got nobody else. Like, who else is there? And
Right.
so from a practical level, there's a lot of reform that needs to happen. We need a system that's interested in truth and not efficiency,
Mm,
right? So we don't want to bring these people through the system quickly, not even go to trial, do plea bargains, and just get them in and out. Exodus 20 verse 16 says you should not give false testimony against your neighbor. That's giving false testimony against someone to say that they are guilty and to tell them to be guilty when they didn't do it.
mm,
And then we need a system that's based on grace for everyone, not just for some. So we need to do away with these mandatory minimums, and in a lot of cases we need to get rid of life and prosecutorial overreach.
yes.
We need to get rid of those things. And then we need to develop more alternatives to incarceration. Some
Mm,
people literally just have a drug treatment.
right.
Have a drug problem and they need treatment.
Right.
People have mental health issues. We could do restitution, community service, mentor programs. And then we need less laws because, like I said, crime has steadily gone down. It's been a little bit of a jiggle, but it's definitely a downward trajectory. It's because we have too much laws. And there's actually a precedent for it. There's several states that have found that incarceration is too expensive. One of them is Texas. Texas is lock them up state.
Mhm.
Lock them up, throw away the key. And so they had this building spree. They were giddy about building prisons up until like 2007. And they were like, oh, wow, it costs a lot to keep these people in prison.
Yeah.
And then the market crashed. And
Right.
so they had to stop. And so they said, you know what, we're going to have to change the system because we just have too many people in prison. So then they changed the laws that put all these nonviolent people in prison. And guess what happened? happens a couple of years later. They had to close several prisons and crime decreased.
Wow.
So the thing is, and so with the system, we need to work on less laws. And then also for people who actually have done wrong, we need to work on a system that restores them back to a right relationship. First with God, then with family, and with society. Because with the laws, we're basically saying you broke this law, this inanimate law, but you also broke your pact with society. You broke your relationship with people.
Yeah.
And so there's more focus on restorative justice now, where people are brought before people who experience the type of crime that they did. They won't be introduced to their victim,
right,
but they get to speak to families that did, so that they could see in living color, like, wow, when I raped this person, this is what the experience was. When I killed this person just because of road rage, this is what their daughter has to live with, and those things. And so, and all of that is the gospel.
yeah,
We were guilty, but we didn't even have to do the time. But then we were restored into God's family. And now we can be used and be productive members of the kingdom, just like we want these prisoners to be productive members of society.
absolutely. Whew, this is good. I remember in college I was a sociology major, and I was taking this class, Sociology of Deviance, and it just reminded me of something that what's embedded in laws or in the legal system is basically kind of what you said. It is reaffirming to the rest of society that this is how we as a group feel about this particular action. Because the thing is, when you kill somebody, that person's not coming back. You can't uncommit your crimes. So
Right.
yes, we need to. I'm not saying don't punish anybody. I'm just saying the punishment is not as much, is not only about, I'll say, the punishing the criminal. It's also about reasserting to society the standard that we are saying we collectively agree on.
Right.
And I think that gets lost in the shuffle, and
Yes.
especially when that mentality is reinforced in an unfair pattern with a specific group of people. Now you're unconsciously reasserting to society, this is how we feel about these actions from these people. And so
Sure.
it goes a step above just reasserting the values, quote unquote, of the society. So, man, that's good stuff. Okay, one last question. Well, let me see if there's any questions in there. If y'all have any questions, speak now or hold your peace until the next time. And let me know too if y'all want to see a part 2, because we were talking about doing something like that. Okay. Let me see here. Can't paint a broad brush. Yes, facts. You say you're preaching. Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. I don't even want to give any more, because it's going to give us a whole new discussion. So I want to say thank you. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else has learned a lot. And listen, if this is something you already knew, share this with somebody who doesn't. Once again, we're just trying to bring clarity to the situation. We're not trying to bash anybody. I don't have a side that I'm on, except for the side of truth and justice, and where Christ would have me be. So that's where we stand. And I really enjoyed this discussion.
Me too.
Until next time, thank you, Richelle. And
Thank you, Alex.
man, this is so good. We'll definitely be doing this again. God bless.
God bless.